6. An aristocrat or revolutionary. An Iranian Fedayeen. There was one person whose entire demeanor made him look like a son from the Iranian aristocracy. His name was Ahmad Jabari. I was introduced to Ahmad in 1971 when he was still a graduate student of economics at Washington University. Ahmad had the appearance of an Iranian aristocrat, particularly in the way he spoke, even though there was nothing in his name to attribute any significant lineage. When I finally found out about his recent background, he was far from being that. Taghi, my compatriot, was skeptical about him because Taghi believed, wrongfully, that he was a plant from the Shah's secret police savak. At that time, Iranian foreign students were notoriously fearful of the savak within their midst. Taghi had put him onto me because he was an economics student, and he thought that maybe I could give him some guidance. Among other things, Ahmad was a very good cook of Iranian food, and one day, while I was in St. Louis, he invited me to his apartment for dinner. As we ate and spoke, he surprisingly opened up a lot of his past to me. Ahmad had actually been sent by the Shah's regime to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, to study aerospace engineering, and was halfway through his course when he just quit this prestigious school in Boston and tried to disappear from the savak. I don't know how or when he became such a radical opponent of the Shah, but his escape was rather extreme. He traveled to Jordan to join the PLO in its fight against Zionism and the liberation of Palestine. Jordan, at that time, was ruled by King Hussein, who had fought 3 wars with Israel, including the 1967 Six-Day War, which ended in Jordan's loss of the West Bank. In 1970, King Hussein decided to expel the Palestinian fighters, the Fedayeen, from Jordan after they had threatened his country's security. This internal crisis was soon to be known as Black September. Ahmad said that Chairman Arafat, the head of the PLO, had ample warning that King Hussein of Jordan was about to expel the Fedayeen fighters from Jordan. In preparation for this event, Arafat had ordered that all foreign fighters should leave Jordan ahead of that time. Ahmad himself left Jordan in 1969 and traveled back to the USA. He ended up in St. Louis, Missouri, where he enrolled as a graduate student in economics, as he believed that that was the most relevant study for understanding revolution. It is at this point that Taghi told him to check in with me. Entering and being tutored. Ahmad and I had a few things in common. When I met him in the summer of 1971, we were both graduate students in economics. In fact, he became very helpful to me through my second year of coursework before my thesis research. Here's what was happening. Throughout the USA, graduate students were quitting courses in physics and mathematics and enrolling in advanced courses in economics. Economics had now become a mathematical science, and these former physics students were all excellent at the new math, while those of us who had come through the philosophical thinking of economics were having a rough time. Ahmad Jabari found this to be baby maths, as he called it. He soon became my go-to person to get me through the mathematical requirements of my discipline. In my second year of graduate school at Cornell University, I was assigned the task of using Pontryagin maximum principle to determine the required investment levels for economic growth in an emerging economy. You're probably asking, what is that about? For starters, Lev Pontryagin was a Russian mathematician who had formulated his maximum principle in 1956. Its initial application was in calculating the maximum speed that a rocket would need to escape Earth's gravity, breaching the boundary of outer space, weightlessness, and falling into a higher orbit around the Earth. Good for him. But why did I need to know this calculation as an economist? Well, those non philosophical economists were positing that a developing country needed a certain level of investment to boost its economy out of the orbit of poverty and slow growth into the orbit of rapid capital accumulation and faster growth. Now, you couldn't get a farther cry from my old refrain to who won the Corn Laws debate. How do we do this? Well, this is where old Punchy came into the picture. In mathematics, actually in the field of differential equations, there's a premise called the boundary value problem. It comprises differential equations with a set of additional constraints called the boundary conditions. Here's the key. The solution to the differential equation must also satisfy the boundary conditions. If you are totally lost by now, don't feel embarrassed. Most of us in economics were lost too and had mounted a strong pushback to the mathematization of economic theory. This came mostly from those of us who viewed economics as an integral part of the philosophy of life and struggle. The mathematics in economics was quite a struggle for some of us to figure out. Be surprised to know that later on, I came to appreciate the mathematics in economics because, in a peculiar sense, it allowed me to bridge the intuitive gap between facts and wisdom. Translating this gobbledygook into practical application, these boundary conditions represented such factors like the high population growth rate, the low level of literacy, shortage of skills, high dependence on foreign investment, etc. Unlike astronomical science, in economics, Pontryagin's principles were very precise calculations, but based on imprecise assumptions. Their redemptive value was that they established an indicative quantitative level of investments that included raising all of these boundary conditions to acceptable levels and still inducing capital growth. 5 years later, I was championing this very thinking in modeling appropriate responses to counter the impact of the removal of preferential prices for our bananas in the UK market. Anyway, as I said, don't lose any sleep over this. I didn't, and neither did Ahmad. In fact, he helped me get through my presentation, which resulted in me receiving the nod from my examination committee to proceed to the candidature for the doctorate degree. Presenting on the Ayatollah's Revolution. Stayed in contact with Ahmad Jabari several years after we had both received our doctorate in economics. He acquitted himself very well in the coming years. Sometime after he had graduated, he sent me a magazine article with a story of how the CIA had botched an attempt to recruit him to spy for them on the regime of the Shah. It was clear that they had been following his progress since he escaped from MIT and had assumed that he was now in opposition to the Shah. However, he had been briefed so well by us in the Oil Committee International that he was able to tape the final encounter with the agent who was trying to recruit him. By the time the Shah had been overthrown by Ayatollah Khomeini on February 11, 1979, Ahmad had a teaching position in a small college, Center College of Kentucky in Dansville, Kentucky. In the same tradition of targeting students, within 4 months of the overthrow of the Shah, he was organizing a symposium at his college for Iranian students residing throughout the USA. It was entitled Iran, a Revolution in the Making, and was held on June the 15th to 17th, 1979. Surprisingly, he insisted that I should give one of the feature addresses. My speech was labeled Revolutionary Struggle Over Economy, Some Experienced Benchmarks. Needless to say, the groups of Iranian students were probably taken aback by the presence of a black person from the Caribbean lecturing them about the Iranian economy. It brought home to me how little some of the non-white students from the Middle East had realized the influence of American racism on their thinking. For whereas there was no less than 5 white speakers on the previous day, lecturing them on various topics about culture and the religion, None of them had even ventured to ask these speakers the questions they asked me. Have you ever been to Iran? Yes. Do you speak Farsi? No. Do you have any Iranian friends? Yes. Are you Christian? Yes. I had presented some controversial benchmarks, which I hoped would spark a contentious debate. One of the more controversial benchmarks was that the Iranian Revolution should first try to delink from the world capitalist system, redefine the role of the economy, and then re-enter into the world capitalist system. A benchmark that the Islamic regime failed to recognize, even though it did the delinking on religion and cultural lines. Because of this, Iran became a helpless victim of Western economic sanctions. In these matters, you would never know. Maybe the messages were received by some of the attendees who did not ask the questions. In any case, the proceedings were published in a book and made available to a wider Middle Eastern audience.